Angel Eduardo Maradiaga Espinoza traveled to the United States earlier this year. He was 17 years old, a dedicated athlete who had dreams of becoming a soccer player. But he was from Honduras, and he wanted better medical care than he could access in his home country. A cousin in Tampa, Florida, agreed to be his sponsor in the United States, and everything was in order when he left Honduras on April 25th. He even made sure to pack enough medication to last 3 months, just in case. Angel entered the United States on May 3rd at the Reynosa, Mexico crossing, and immigration and customs officials placed him on a plane to Florida on May 5th. His next stop was the Gulf Coast shelter operated by Jewish Family and Children's Services. But on the morning of May 10th, 2023, staff found that Angel had died in his sleep, evidently from a seizure. He had had a physical exam at a clinic on May 8th, but he did not disclose his epilepsy or his medication. He also didn't have his 3 months' worth of medication with him when he arrived on May 5th, and it was unclear what had happened to it. However, his family had sent his medical files ahead to Gulf Coast twice for good measure, and these documents were uploaded into the system. Tragically, staff did not read the files, and Angel died just miles away from the better health care he had come to the United States to receive. This was the kind of case where immigration policy was meant to shine, not meant to end in heartbreak. But at least 2 stressors were prominent in making this tragedy possible. First, while the United States itself might be the answer an asylum seeker needs, fear and uncertainty often characterize encounters with the U.S. immigration system. For example, you might have found it curious that Angel didn't disclose his epilepsy, but it's not unusual for asylum seekers to hide medical conditions. As Danielle Hernandez, an immigration attorney, explained for the Tampa Bay Times, you don't know when you're 17 that your health won't be held against you when you're seeking asylum. Anna Lamb, an immigration rights activist, explained that this climate of fear was created by types of immigration laws passed over the years. All the laws being implemented in this state are terrorizing people, she said. We will see more of this if we don't take care of people coming in. And second, the U.S. immigration system itself is overburdened. In Angel's case, this resulted in the staff's failure to read the medical notes that would have likely saved his life. And in the tragic story described by Valerie Gonzalez in AP News, it was denial of care in the case of Anadith Tene Reyes Alvarez, an 8-year-old girl who died in Border Patrol custody on May 17th. Although the policy is that people are not to be held in custody more than 72 hours, Anadith's family, her mom and dad, along with 2 siblings who were 14 and 12 years old, had already been in custody for 9 days when Anadith died. After crossing the border in Brownsville, Texas on May 9th, she was diagnosed with influenza by a doctor. They were then transferred to the Harlingen station on May 14th. The first morning they were there, she awoke to fever, headache, and bone pain. Her mother, Mabel Alvarez Benedicts, reported those conditions, but the border agent, who was not a medical caregiver, waved it off, saying, "Oh, your daughter's growing up. That's why her bones hurt. Give her water." Mabel shared the doctor's diagnosis and insisted on taking Anadith to the hospital, but agents refused. Instead, they issued saline fluids and fever medication. But her breathing worsened. She found it difficult to walk, and a sore throat kept her from eating. On Wednesday, they requested an ambulance, which was denied. Later that day, she became unconscious and spit up blood. By the time agents agreed to take her to the hospital, she had no vital signs. Anadith was born with a congenital heart disease that required surgery 3 years ago. It was a successful surgery, and she dreamed of becoming a doctor herself. Instead, she became another victim of the tragedies that have come to characterize the southern U.S. border, even for those seeking asylum, who travel to the United States with the hope of relief from suffering or violence. That the suffering at the border is overwhelming, that's an understatement. For example, on May 21st, more than 27,000 migrants were being held in detention by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Over 240,000 more people were being monitored through the Alternatives to Detention programs. According to the ACLU, the United States spends $1.84 billion on these detentions. Border deaths have also been climbing each year. The dangers are well known. The terrain is often risky in itself. Dangerous rivers, extreme heat, deadly heights, including from border barriers. And then there's the deadliness that often accompanies smuggling organizations, who are notorious for everything from packing dozens of people into tractor trailers to abandoning migrants in dangerous locations. In 2021, more than 560 migrants died. That was a new record on the border. Until 2022, when more than 850 migrants died on the border. And that was despite the fact that Border Patrol had actually increased rescues and life-saving operations. In 2022, they performed more than 22,000 rescues, up 72% from 2021. These numbers are almost definitely lower than the real totals. The U.S. Government Accountability Office issued a report to congressional communities in April 2022 that documented, quote, that Border Patrol has not collected and recorded or reported to Congress complete data on migrant deaths or disclosed associated data limitations. Specifically, Border Patrol did not record all available information on migrant deaths from external entities in its system of record or describe these data limitations in its report. The International Organization for Migration, United Nations group, recorded more than 1,200 migrant deaths in the West in 2021, and more than 700 of them were on the U.S.-Mexico border. They named that border the deadliest land crossing in the world. Last September, a Morning Edition report from NPR recounted how a county sheriff in Texas even shared that their local funeral director had run out of room to store bodies until they could be transported to a neighboring county. Right now, he said, they're overwhelmed. It's important to look at this situation honestly, even though it's painful. Immigration is an issue of life and death. Beyond the politics of choosing strategies to address immigration issues, we need to return to the question of ethics. Basic human decency should energize and motivate all of us to resist easy narratives that allow us to justify the status quo. As Robin Reinecke, a University of Arizona professor and co-founder of the Colibri Center for Human Rights, has rightly explained, it isn't just a matter of strategy. It's a matter of human life and the costs socially and morally to an entire generation of border residents and families of those who died crossing. At the heart of our flawed policies is a commitment to deterrence, a commitment that has been prominent since at least the 1990s. The idea was that if illegal crossings could be stopped at the safest, easiest, most accessible places, potential migrants would be discouraged from trying to cross the border at more dangerous locations. It would be too much of a risk. But that's not what happened, and immigrants continued to cross the border. Each renewed commitment to deterrence created more and more dangerous crossings, and yet migrants continued to be willing to take those risks. This history should make it clear to us that deterrence policies, at least as they have been generally legislated and enforced, don't address the root issues driving immigration. Our policies have failed to honestly wrestle with the conditions that make dangerous border crossings worth the risk to thousands and thousands of people every year. Instead, we have focused on criminalizing migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. We've also normalized denying them basic rights, including the right to a trial for those facing deportation. As Erica Bryant wrote for the Vera Institute of Justice, Many immigrants with the legal right to live in the United States are deported simply because they can't afford an attorney to help them navigate notoriously complicated immigration proceedings. For example, more than 3/4 of immigration court cases in 2019 had no legal representation, even though studies had shown that immigrants with attorneys were 3.5 times more likely to be granted bond, enabling them to be released from detention, and up to 10 times more likely to establish their right to remain in the United States than those without representation. Deportation can then have severe impacts on already vulnerable people, including exile from home, separation from family, loss of income, and even forcible return to dangerous conditions in a person's country of origin. As the ACLU reminds us, when the government has the power to deny legal rights and due process to one vulnerable group, everyone's rights are at risk. These stories and issues are particularly relevant and important now as the Biden administration rolls out a new border plan that largely relies on recycling past policies. For the last 2 years, the administration's approach has depended on extending the Title 42 policy that the Trump administration created, which used the COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext to quickly expel migrants without any due process. As that policy finally expired in May, officials anticipated a wave of new migrants that largely did not materialize that would join the already crowded border. In response, they stationed 1,500 more troops at the border. This means that the United States now has 4,000 soldiers stationed along the U.S.-Mexico border. As Fernando Garcia, executive director of Border Network for Human Rights, put it, now, without a doubt, we can say that the U.S.-Mexico border is one of the most militarized borders in the world. That continues to perpetuate this idea that the border is an issue that can be solved through enforcement, in this case, the deployment of the military. That's very wrong because it fails to recognize the nature of what we're seeing. The Biden administration's reliance on Title 42 was already broadly viewed as a failure to live up to the campaign promises he made that the U.S., quote, must do better to uphold our laws humanely and preserve the dignity of immigrant families, refugees, and asylum seekers. And this criticism was intensified when the administration proposed its own asylum ban that doubled down on some of the most cruel aspects of past policy. Ari Sawyer described the rule for Human Rights Watch, quote, through its presumption of asylum ineligibility for certain non-citizens, Biden's new rule combines a version of former President Donald Trump's third country transit ban, a policy Biden once campaigned against and a federal judge ruled unlawful, with additional asylum restrictions. In a nutshell, the policy continues the practice of turning away people seeking asylum at the U.S. border, unless, one, the request for asylum was already rejected at another country they traveled through to get there, or two, the asylum seeker was waiting for months in Mexico in order to get an appointment at the border. In the latter case, Sawyer points out that, quote, these appointments would be available only through a privacy-intrusive and internet-dependent cell phone application used by Customs and Border Protection called CBP-1, which facial recognition technology that has been shown to reinforce racial discrimination in law enforcement and has driven family separation. Unfortunately, a rule like this risks increasing pressure for migrants to cross the border illegally. For example, metering programs like CBP-1 sound convenient, but the courts have previously ruled them as illegal for good reasons. While asylum seekers wait, often indefinitely, while they try their luck at getting one of just a few appointments available, their safety is increasingly at risk. They're forced to endure uncertain and often violent conditions, whether in a home country which was dangerous enough to make them want to leave, or in border cities which have their own dangers. And while they wait, the risks of a dangerous border crossing become more and more tolerable. The Biden administration's rule was sufficiently outrageous that even employees from the Department of Homeland Security, the asylum personnel that would implement the policy, filed a complaint against it. They called it, quote, contrary to the moral fabric of our nation, and said implementing it would require them to violate their oaths. Their union, representing 14,000 employees, commented that the rule rewrites the statute Congress enacted and said, quote, at their core, the measures that the proposed rule seeks to implement are inconsistent with the asylum law enacted by Congress, the treaties the United States has ratified, and our country's moral fabric and longstanding tradition of providing safe haven to the persecuted. Rather, it is draconian and represents the elevation of a single policy goal, reducing the number of migrants crossing the southwest border over human life and our country's commitment to refugees, end quote. I agree with that criticism, but I also recognize the complexities involved here. To their credit, the Biden administration did establish a program led by Vice President Kamala Harris for creating a U.S. strategy for addressing the root causes of migration in Central America. They released a report in July 2021 that acknowledged addressing the root causes of migration is critical to our overall immigration effort. Providing relief is not sufficient to stem migration from the region, and unless we address all of the root causes, problems will persist. The report's pillars are solid, naming important root causes driving immigration that must be addressed if we're ever going to actually make headway. Economic insecurity and inequality, corruption, lack of human rights, including labor rights and a free press, organized violence and crime, and sexual, gender-based, and domestic violence. And Vice President Harris's cover message also emphasizes the need to build on what works while pivoting away from what does not work. It will not be easy, she wrote, and progress will not be instantaneous, but we are committed to getting it right. The challenging truth is that it's difficult to be patient during a crisis and do the hard work of getting to the roots, especially if the crisis has been centuries in the making. And from a political point of view, public discourse tends to be caught in a tug of war between arguments emphasizing the necessity of a secure border and arguments emphasizing the rights and humanity of those crossing the border. And because immigration is tangled up in so many other open wounds in U.S. history and culture, talking about immigration puts us directly in the path of discussions about colonialism, imperialism, and centuries of systemic racism and classism. There are painful, difficult, and even shameful parts of U.S. history that we are tempted to forget rather than honestly acknowledging and addressing them. The related social issues are also painful and complex, from honestly acknowledging intractable economic justice and labor exploitation to wrestling with the painful realities around drug production, distribution, and addiction on both sides of the border. Those kinds of conversations and transformations are hard work, and it's easier to dehumanize immigrants and one another. This has made immigration issues particularly vulnerable to partisan divides, and while we argue, more and more people suffer. I called this reflection a lament because my main goal is simply to return our awareness to the tragedies suffered by migrants, especially along the U.S. southern border, but also around the world, to our grief and hopefully to our care. As James Baldwin taught us, the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. Beyond our partisan divides, beyond our fears, beyond the difficult history that both binds us together and drives us apart, we share a common humanity. No one wants to suffer, and our well-being is bound up together. To be fully human in this moment requires us to honestly look at the continued abuses and injustices suffered by migrants and to act in ways that embody and insist on the humanity, safety, and well-being of all, including and especially vulnerable asylum seekers and refugees. We should not, we cannot stand idly by. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.